As Ellen said, back in 2018, we gave a presentation to the board about the CGRIP program that had just been rolled out in the Texas Mid-Coast. And we were kind of waiting for some of our partners to step up with funding before we could expand the program. And last year, the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries stepped up and contributed $100,000 for 3 years to start up a CGRIP program in Southwest Louisiana. So what I want to do today is just kind of go through the nuts and bolts of the CGRIP program as it is in Southwest Louisiana. And hopefully what I can get from you folks is some help in spreading the word about this new landowner incentive program, especially in the 5 focal areas, which I'll show here in a minute. So why is the Gulf Coast Joint Venture in the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries interested in grasslands in Southwest Louisiana? Well, as you probably know, grasslands provide a lot of habitat for a lot of different bird species, but a lot of those bird species in Southwest Louisiana and the Texas coastal grasslands have shown dramatic declines over the past few decades, including the northern bobwhite and the mottled duck. So when the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries came to the joint venture, mottled duck was the species that they were primarily interested in. And why the grasslands are important for mottled ducks is that grasslands provide the nesting habitat where mottled ducks nest, and mottled ducks the only migratory bird species that doesn't really migrate. It resides kind of here in the western Gulf Coast is the extent of its range. And you can see from this graph, there's been a pretty dramatic decline in those numbers in the last couple decades. So Louisiana Department of Wildlife and the Gulf Coast Joint Venture feel that the Grassland Restoration Incentive Program can really help by incentivizing landowners to maybe do some good stuff for grassland bird habitat on their properties. So what is CGRIP? CGRIP is just a means to provide financial incentives to private landowners to implement habitat practices that improve the grassland habitat for birds on their property. CGRIP is a totally voluntary program. It reimburses landowners a set rate for identified practices that are identified by a project manager and the landowner to help address those limiting factors that are keeping bird abundance low on their properties. So the management practices basically fall into the categories of brush management, prescribed burning, native grass reseeding, and prescribed grazing. And some of the grassland species that we're hoping this program is going to directly impact are the northern bobwhite, loggerhead shrike, LeConte sparrow, and as I mentioned, mottled duck is primarily the species that we're focused on early on in Louisiana. So here are the 5 focal areas in Southwest Louisiana. You'll see 3 of those focal areas are south of I-10, and that's where we feel like we're probably going to have the most impact on the mottled duck as far as improving their nesting habitat. What we'd like to see is a grassland nesting habitat within a mile of some kind of shallow wetland that'll provide broodering habitat where the hen can take her ducklings to that shallow wetland after they hatch. So the eligibility requirements for CGRIP are, first of all, the treatment area of the project needs to be located within one of those 5 focal areas. The treatment area has to be on private land. This private land program. The treatment area needs to be at least 25 acres in size. The treatments that are being proposed in the project proposal are eligible practices that are on the practice list, and they're the ones that are being recommended by the CGRIP project manager. The landowner agrees to cover any amount above what they receive in CGRIP funding. And that incentive is basically we'll pay about 50% of the EQIP practice rate for whatever the state of Louisiana's EQIP practice rates are. The maximum amount for individual projects starting out is $25,000. That's the amount we started with in Texas. And then after a couple years of the project running, the initiative team over there decided to increase that amount to $50,000 per project, to allow projects to affect more acres of habitat. The last requirement is the landowner has to be committed to keeping the habitat in that improved project state for at least 5 years after the project's completed, and the property is under a conservation easement. So this is basically the flow of how the program works. The landowner contacts a resource professional. That can be any partner biologist of the GCJV organization. For Louisiana, it could be Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, technical guidance biologist. It could be an NRCS employee. It could be a Ducks Unlimited employee, Audubon. There's a variety of different groups that can serve as project managers. The project manager then meets with the landowner. They kind of walk through what the landowner's long-term plans are for the property and what the limiting factors are for the grassland bird species on the property, and come up with a plan of some practices that the landowner can and is willing to implement to improve that grassland habitat. They work together, develop a project proposal. The project proposal gets submitted to me. We have an independent review process of 3 or 4 other people that look at the project and kind of give it a thumbs up to make sure the practices being recommended are practices that will impact those limiting factors and improve the habitat. Once I get that back from the review committee, I work with the project manager or the landowner. If there's any things in the project proposal the review committee would like to see addressed, then I put together a landowner agreement between the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries Foundation and the landowner. The foundation is the group that kind of holds the funds and are the ones that write the check to the landowner once the project is completed. Once the agreement is signed by both parties, work can begin on the project. Once the project is completed and verified by the project manager, I send a form over to the foundation saying the project's complete and up to standards, and then they put a check to the landowner. Generally, our funding cycle for CGRIP runs from the 1st of September through the 15th of July. The annual amount we have each year for projects is about $90,000 for each year of 3 years. And a project like this wouldn't be successful if it didn't have buy-in for several partners. These are all the partners, both Texas and Louisiana, for CGRIP in both states. In Louisiana, the pertinent ones are Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, the Louisiana Wildlife and Fisheries Foundation, and then NRCS. And with that, here's my contact information. If anybody's got any questions, I'd be happy to answer those.
Steve, 2 questions. When you say this property goes under the conservation easement, is there a time frame with that easement? Is it for what, how many years, or is it in perpetuity?
Well, that's not really a requirement of the program. It's an option to ensure that there's long-term perpetuity in the work that we're paying for.
Okay, I mean that's, if you're going to do something like this, you know, I can see, and I would highly recommend and support that this land is put under an easement to maintain what you want to do and to establish these populations and keep these populations. My second question is, for instance, you have some pasture land. How would this program, or could you use this land that you put into this program to graze cattle?
Yes. Cattle grazing is a very instrumental tool in managing grasslands.
All right, what about for hay production?
We have a treatment that we will pay. We would prefer people to wait till after, I believe it's July 15th to hay, but we will pay a rate for landowners that are willing to wait until after July 15th to hay their property.
Well, I guess when you do that, how does this impact the population of birds that you've established if you go out there and you do cut hay on that land?
We would probably recommend that the haying be done in a variety of pattern, that it leaves different stages of grassland in the property. We would not want to see the entire pasture slicked off. But then it also depends on where the property is located, the amount of rainfall. If it was hayed, would it be able to recover by the next nesting season in order for it to be usable by birds again? And you would need a project manager there with local knowledge, more than what I have on a specific property, to know if that's appropriate or not.
Steve, I had a couple questions. Obviously, you had the figure in there of the $90,000 annually, and I'm assuming that's just inside those shaded areas on the map that you had. Is that correct?
Correct. To be eligible, you got to be within one of the focal areas.
Okay. Then do you have a targeted amount of acres that y'all are looking to try to enroll annually, or is that just kind of based on whatever interest shows up? I didn't know if you had any goals or targets there or not.
It kind of depends on the interest. What we're hoping is we'll be able to increase that amount of money in successive years through different organizations contributing to the program to get it up. Like in Texas, we usually have about $200,000 to $250,000 a year for projects. And we would like to see Louisiana get up to kind of that level. And with that amount of money in Texas, we're impacting probably 10 to 15,000 acres a year.
Okay. My other question, and Ron had touched on it, as we would, our role in promoting this would be obviously our connection with cattle producers in those geographic areas.
Right.
And if we were going to be, contacting them or letting them know about this opportunity, and they have pasture that's in improved varieties, say it's a Bermuda grass pasture. What does that what's that transition look like on that property? And I think you kind of touched on it with brush clearing and native seeding. But if they currently had an improved pasture, would that be eligible, or do they need to establish natives there to be eligible? Or I guess what would that process look like for?
It would depend on what the situation was. If it was suitable nesting habitat for mottle ducks, but for example, it had been started having some Chinese tallow or baccharis starting to invade that pasture, CGRIP would pay to help control that woody invasion to keep it out of the pasture. If the landowner was interested in going to a native warm season grass from their introduced pasture, we would help them convert that pasture to that native warm season grass. We would pay them to defer their cattle grazing while that native grass was being established.
Okay, so really it's going to be, if the producer has interest, their best bet's going to be to have that initial consultation with you or the project manager on site there to kind of lay out what the roadmap looks like for their specific property.
We'll help pay for cross fencing, if they want to do some type of rotational grazing where certain parts of that pasture can be rested. We've got a couple projects in Texas where the landowner is working with 3 or 4 different partners: CGRIP, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Partners Program, the NRCS, are all paying for different parts of a project. Because like, if the landowner needs a water structure or something to help rotate their cattle, that's just too expensive for what CGRIP can pay for. But we can work with them in the NRCS local office there, where maybe CGRIP can pay for the cross fencing and the NRCS could pay for the watering structure if it was needed.
Okay, so CGRIP can be coupled or layered over EQIP or another project going on with NRCS.
Yep.
Okay.
So CGRIP could be an extension of EQIP.
Yeah, I've heard people kind of refer to CGRIP as like EQIP-like program with training wheels. But CGRIP is totally non-federal funded. All the funding for CGRIP comes from non-federal sources, so we don't have an ACP requirement as far as income or any of the other requirements that you have sometimes with federal funded projects.
Steve, it was hard for me to read the areas of the parishes and the areas that were designated on there. Would there be any way to send us a list, if you will, like the parishes, and I know they don't include all of them, but again, from that graph or whatever, it was hard to see that.
Probably the best way, and I'll put this in the chat when I get done, is the CGRIP website. If you go to that website and scroll down, there's the map, and you can zoom in or zoom out to those different focal areas. And most of the focal areas have a hard boundary, a line, a road or something where a landowner knows whether they're in or out.
Yeah, that would be fine. Thank you for that.
Yep.